Welcome to the Primal Parenting Podcast, where we apply ancient human developmental needs to the modern world. The best parenting advice is encoded in your DNA. Primal Parenting will show you how to raise a thriving child because thriving is a human right. Welcome to this March edition of the Primal Parenting Podcast, where we bring you the real science so that you can parent with informed consent and with your God-given instincts in the modern world. This episode of the Culture Files is focused on health and wellness for our children because informed consent is something that has been corrupted and distorted so much in our culture and our society that we parents really have to be aware of where the recommendations are coming through to us from the experts, and commercial and cultural interests may be behind those messages. From media to medicine, often our parenting decisions are not coming from an unbiased place. And so we are not given informed consent by definition because we are not given the full truth. So very often, unfortunately, the truth is shrouded in these other influences, marketing, messaging, and industry profit interests. So we're going to look a little bit into some of the medicine. We have to talk very carefully on these topics because censorship is still extremely in effect in society. And so we are going to be talking about gene therapies that recently have been at issue. And when we talk about those medicines, medical interventions for our children or for ourselves, we're just going to use this gesture instead of the words. We're going to take a look at a report from one of my favorite journalists of all time, Naomi Wolf, as she discusses the data that was revealed when the documents were released from the major manufacturer of this medicine that was analyzed by Naomi Wolf's team. And just to remind you of what was found at that time, because I noticed since I covered this for CHD TV that it has been scrubbed. And we have to remember how much these companies that produce these types of medicines, how much fraud they have been convicted of. And in fact, these papers that Naomi Wolf analyzes wouldn't even have ever seen the light of day if it weren't for a court order. And that becomes very apparent when you understand what these documents reveal about fertility, heart damage, and specifically miscarriage. So if you are pregnant or know someone who is or wants to become pregnant, this is critical information to share with them. And you can go directly to the source, obviously, and that would be Naomi Wolf's Substack.
Who knew in May of 2021 that the vaccines had caused heart damage in 35 minors within a week after the injection. You've got to understand that all of the documents say FDA confidential at the bottom of them, right? Pfizer and the FDA shared these documents. And the FDA knew that 35 minors sustained heart damage. But the government of the United States, and I'm embarrassed to say I voted for these people, didn't tell parents until August of 2021 that there was an elevated risk of heart damage in healthy young adults.
We were getting reports by the thousands in partnership with an organization in Australia called Voices for Choices. They were really doing the heavy lifting on this project, but I headed a project at CHD called Athletes for Health Freedom. The Athletes for Health Freedom Initiative, I believe is what we called it. And this was a roundtable on one of the CHD TV Good Morning CHD episodes we devoted to covering all of the headlines of these young, healthy athletes with no other conditions that were having major medical events and actually passing away on live TV. And that's the reason that they were even reported, is that athletes are in the spotlight. And so we were very concerned by the level of reporting.
This is is a special exclusive episode that we have for you all about athletes for health freedom. We're thrilled to have Angela Braden on TV team along with Brian Hooker and Dr.
The CDC said it stays in the injection site. And then it says, and I remember asking doctors, like relatives were doctors and were funded by NIH grants, where does the spike protein go? And they were like, journalist, you've got an ear for nonsense. They were like, well, your body metabolizes it. You'll digest it and excrete it. And it's like they have no evidence to give me the basis for their response. But in fact, that's not what happens to these materials. And knew that these materials biodistribute, this is Pfizer's language, throughout your body in 48 hours. And where do they settle? Lipid nanoparticles are designed to cross every membrane in the human body. They've known this for 10 years. So where do these ingredients go? They go to the brain. Some of you have noticed changes in the personalities of loved ones who have taken these injections. They biodistribute to the liver, the adrenals, the spleen, and if you're a woman, they accumulate in your ovaries. Now, these are industrial fats coated with polyethylene glycol in your ovaries, okay? And really scary, Dr. Robert Chandler, who's a respected pathologist who's treated the Lakers and the Angels, he wrote this report and he shows that the chart shows the graph going down as it leaves the injection site, but going up as it accumulates in these various organs over time. And what's incredibly scary if you're a woman is that there's no mechanism that we've found by which the body gets rid of the lipid nanoparticles in the ovaries. So your first injection, some go into your ovaries. Your second injection, more go into your ovaries. Your booster, more go into your ovaries. There's no mechanism with which the body can release this material that we've seen.
Let's not forget, also, we are dedicating this Culture Files episode of the Primal Parenting Podcast to health and medicine for our children, because it's the third baseline of primal parenting, and that is natural medicine and nutrition, which includes breastfeeding. And breastfeeding, of course, is so important at the beginning of life. If you are planning to have a baby, if you're expecting and you're making this decision, if you look back at anthropological studies and understand breastfeeding over human history, it's apparent from anthropological studies and studies of hunter-gatherer societies still that all women can breastfeed. It's not this narrative that we're given. I remember when I was pregnant and making the decision whether I wanted to try to breastfeed, how it was talked about in all the books and how it was presented to me was that you could try and you may be one of the lucky ones, or you may not be able to. And it's just not really informed. Again, it's just not informed. It's not an informed consent narrative, because the reality in looking at throughout human history is that less than 10% of females have an anatomical or physical reason why they cannot breastfeed. Otherwise, it's environmentally induced. In other words, there's some reason, there's some interruption of the natural process of beginning to lactate, or there is some interference that isn't natural. If you are considering you are able to breastfeed, you are able to. So just go into it knowing that it's not a decision of, am I going to try? It's, am I going to be able to learn and avoid the interferences? Am I going to be able to learn about what saboteurs may be at play, including marketing from Big Formula. Big Formula and the big other companies that we don't say the names, but they are owned by the same parent companies and they work together. And so we have to be careful in talking about this, but this episode is to help give you informed consent when it comes to those types of companies. And you have to understand that the formula companies have a very powerful vested interest in reducing breastfeeding rates. And they do that in many ways. And so that is very thoroughly outlined in my book. But for now, we're just going to take a look at reasons to choose to become educated about breastfeeding and to plan to breastfeed your baby if you're an expecting mom. This issue is timely because the FDA has just in January announced the new limits for lead in baby food. And this is something that health advocates for children have been working on for years to try to get the lead out of baby food and baby formula. The FDA did reduce the lead limits for baby food, but unfortunately, it did not address baby formula at all. Only baby food, and it reduced the allowable amounts of lead in the baby food. But according to the FDA documents, the guidance does not cover infant formula beverages or snack foods like puffs and teething biscuits. So those apparently still have no legal limit of lead. So we need to use our God-given judgment as parents, whether to use any of those processed packaged products for our children. And also just know that there is no safe level of lead at all for children. Going back to a report from 2019 by Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, it was found that 95% of baby foods randomly pulled off of supermarket shelves did contain toxic heavy metals. And so we just have to ask ourselves, right? Why is baby formula being left out of this? Why is baby formula immune to these regulations? The regulations are subpar, but at least there's something in place that can be followed. But the baby formula, so if you're not breastfeeding, it's the only way for the baby to not starve, right? It's the only way to get any kind of nourishment, and it has no regulation in terms of lead. So this is good to know for parents who are contemplating this decision. Under the new guidelines, baby food manufacturers should have no more than 10 parts per billion of lead. And this is covering items like baby yogurts, custards, puddings, and single ingredient meats, processed fruits and vegetables, and mixtures of fruits, nuts, grains, and meat. So are we happy about this, or are we unhappy with the lacking of legal levels for baby formula? And how do we feel about having lead in the food at all? Any amount. Let me know in the comments, because I know there's a lot of savvy parents out there, and we just have to go to the grocery aisle with informed consent what we put in our children's bodies. A couple of my go-to experts on this topic of baby formula toxins are Dr. Stephanie Seneff and Dr. Michelle Perro, who issued a report last year in May 21 of 24 about the heavy metals in infant formula. They did their own original research, and they found that aluminum was detected in 100% of the samples of baby formula, ranging from 1.61 parts per million to 41 parts per million. Lead, according to Drs. Perro and Seneff, was also present in 100% of the samples of baby formula. Dr. Seneff and Perro also found that arsenic, cadmium, and mercury were detected in the samples. 57% for arsenic, 55% of the samples were positive for mercury, and 35% of the samples were positive for cadmium. How much cadmium? Nearly twice as much that's allowed in drinking water. So those are getting into the formula, and there's really no regulation to stop them at this point, which goes back to another very timely current event in our culture, and that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being confirmed as our new HHS Secretary. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is someone I worked with personally at Children's Health Defense. And my observations have been that he is 100% not able to be bought. He's 100% authentic. So we're very excited to have RFK Jr. heading up HHS, because HHS is actually tasked with investigating what causes chronic illness. And especially in children, we have a chronic illness epidemic. We have actually the worst health outcomes in the world. According to RFK Jr., we have the most chronic disease, and he is now committing his devotion to uncovering what is going on, what environmental factors are causing these chronic illnesses in our children at such alarming and increasing rates. Now, what's really interesting is his core base, people that I served as an editor at Children's Health Defense, the Defender, the news outlet that is produced by Children's Health Defense, it's extremely censored. But when I left over 2 years ago, it was reaching millions of views, more than CNN at the time. And it is credible news organization. I know because I onboarded the editor back when it was launched from a newsletter to the Defender, and the editor and anyone else that was brought onto the team was meticulous. Children's Health Defense Defender would not publish a piece if they didn't have at least 3 credible sources saying the same thing. So a consensus of at least 3. And that's an old tenet that I learned in journalism school back when we did real journalism. The Defender does real journalism. So my point is journalism is in my fiber of my being from going to journalism school and actually caring so tremendously as we do at that young, impressionable age when we're in college. I care about journalistic integrity, and Children's Health Defense had it when almost no one else did. What's happening though is that the core audience, it's not just Children's Health Defense, but the millions of people who are aware, who have done the deep research into the medicine, they are expressing some frustration about RFK Jr.'s statements, committing to being open-minded and exploring all possibilities in terms of what is making our children so sick in such enormous numbers and increasing levels across so many chronic illnesses. And because they feel, and this is what is being discussed, this is finger on the pulse kind of stuff. And they are saying in the comments in response to RFK Jr.'s statements about, we're going to investigate, we're going to find out what's going on. And they're just screaming back at him, you know what it is, what's going on. Why are you not saying it? Well, because guys, he can't just presume to know because the research has been so censored and so stifled. And we're going to talk about Dr. Paul Thomas because he is a prime example of someone that when the medical board took his license, and I'm going to cover the latest in that case in just a moment, but please understand, RFK Jr. is approaching this strategically. He is going to uncover the research that a lot of you know about, that you saw it, before it was taken down, or you've gone to the alternative, independent, integrity journalistic outlets and you've read the research yourself, or you followed a story before, or someone personally who something happened to their child and their story was covered up, about the bill that gave the manufacturers of these for children complete immunity from being sued for deaths and injuries because of their product. And I know you guys, I understand your frustration. I understand that how much pain has been dealt to many parents because of this conflict of interest that's happened, and how eager you are for protections to be in place for other parents, for future children. But just understand, RFK Jr., he is going to get it done. He has to let the science come out first. He can't just be the one saying that this is how it works. He has to let the data speak, right? The data will be able to come forth because it won't be censored anymore. He's not backtracking on his statements. He's not backtracking on the knowledgeable statements that he has made in the past about certain medical interventions for children. He's just doing this investigation and re-engineering of HHS, Health and Human Services, in a strategic, proper way that later will be much harder to censor and dismantle by the powerful industries that need to keep it alive for their billions and billions of dollars in profits. If he does it this way, it will be much harder to undo. And so let's be patient and watch this unfold. And for more information on the childhood epidemics and specifically how to heal from them, if you do have a child with a neurological or some kind of injury or chronic illness that was environmentally induced, let's say, or the food, the formula, whatever the environmental toxins that caused the condition or illness. If you want more info on that, check out the Primal Parenting episode with Tracy Schlepcevic, who is also known as the Warrior Mom. And she has a book called The Warrior Mom. So I'll put that up here a few episodes back on the Primal Parenting Podcast. She has a lot of great information for parents who are restoring their children's health and well-being using natural medicine, detox protocols, and all of it is possible. You can make a big difference in your child's life. So please check out that episode and send some love to Tracy. She is truly a warrior mom for all of us. Now to Dr. Paul Thomas. So if you didn't hear this story before, Dr. Paul Thomas ran a pediatric practice of his own for several decades, I believe, before he published a study comparing kids that had it and kids that didn't. That's how we're going to say it. And you can look up his case. I'll put links in the description for this podcast, the Culture Files. But the most recent news in this case is that an amicus brief has been brought to support Dr. Paul Thomas. And an amicus brief is a document in legal proceedings by a credible body or individual. In this case, it is brought by a number of authorities. So they're listed in an amicus brief. You have the authorities listed. So these are it's basically an expert testimony of sorts that is submitted to the court. To Latin root of amicus is a friend. So it's to help support, in this case, Dr. Paul Thomas. Now, Dr. Paul Thomas, I'll just read directly from the summary of argument in the amicus brief. Dr. Paul Thomas, MD, as a credible, likable, published and has over 500 million views on his YouTube channel where he questions this medicine and features non-pharma options for families. His influence is most likely the reason for his license was targeted by respondents in this case, which was the medical board. And just want to bring to all of your attention the medical board corruptions, because these are the authority organizations that control doctors. They control our children's doctors. These medical boards are infamous for taking bribes, taking kickbacks from the industries, allegedly, so the medicines. Dr. Paul Thomas is a very credible pediatrician, board certified pediatrician, and he published data regarding the superior health of the unintervened upon children. And in the amicus brief, it states that medical boards are notorious for promoting pharmaceutical interests at the behest of a private group called the Federation of State Medical Boards. Medical licensing system is broken. For a doctor, they say holistically aligned. I would just say for any doctor that is showing any evidence that goes against the mainstream commercial industry, manufacturers, narratives, parents, we have got to be aware of these influences in order to make informed decisions for our kids. So the amicus brief states the medical licensing system is broken for doctors like Paul Thomas, yet financially lucrative for doctors who sell every medicine. So there are incentives in place to get the parents to submit to all of the recommended medicines. The doctors get bonuses for that, and they get attacked by the medical boards if they don't do that. So just be aware that is the informed consent. That is your informed consent that you're not going to get in the pediatrician's office often not going to get that in the pediatrician's office. So here it is in the Supreme Court of the United States, because only Dr. Paul Thomas had enough help from organizations like Children's Health Defense, and by support and enough courage, just being a badass himself, to stand up to this kind of just absolute warfare, coercion, by taking away his license. The medical boards have effectively become glorified trade guilds that wield state power to protect their own, says the amicus brief. brought in this Supreme Court case. I'll link it below. Tell me what you think. Did you know that medical boards operated this way? Are you interested in the petition to, this is on change.org, to reform medical board corruption? We can all help with this so that more parents get more informed consent and we take some of the corruption and some of the misleading interactions at our doctor's office for our kids. We take some of that out of the equation with these petitions. The topic of medical board corruption sheds light on the unethical practices and misconduct within regulatory bodies overseeing healthcare professionals. And this is nothing new. We know that the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, receives funding from all four of the manufacturing, let's just say the four major manufacturers of the childhood medicines. The petitions call for independent investigation into medical boards accused of accepting kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies. Another petition that I will link also asks for reform to uphold ethical standards and protect patient safety. You can join the movement and hold medical boards accountable and ensure justice prevails in the medical field. More parents are allowed informed consent when they make these very critical decisions for their children's health. So how much of this corruption is RFK Jr. going to be able to undo? It'll be really interesting to watch him work. The FDA gets nearly half of its funding from the companies that it regulates. And this comes in the form of the fees that are paid for new products to be put onto the market. That should definitely change, I think. What do you think? Do you think that parents can get informed consent? Do you think that these regulatory agencies can do their job effectively when they are on the payroll of the companies that they're supposed to regulate? And this is something that RFK Jr. has spoken about very passionately for years. So please do visit the petition on change.org if you would like to help with investigating medical boards like the one that has revoked the medical license of Dr. Paul Thomas only because he published a study that they didn't like the results of. And that was the medicine kids in that group versus the who declined that medicine. Okay. His study was published on PubMed.gov, and the Oregon Medical Board vindictively, the amicus brief states, stripped Dr. Paul Thomas's license. Just an incredible abuse of power. And one example of what we're hoping at the Primal Parenting Podcast that the reform coming from RFK Jr. will address. And finally, we have a famous in the news also recently. A famous gender dysphoria physician has been sued for misdiagnosis, lying, and medical negligence. Imagine that. Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy, one of the most well-known transgender clinicians in the United States, no relation to RFK Jr., incidentally covered in the same episode here. She has been sued by a former patient for allegations of misdiagnosis and failure to provide informed consent. Olson Kennedy, this doctor, is the same doctor who refused to publish a 9-year study of nearly 100 children who received puberty blockers. I guess industry didn't like what that study found. The study was funded by U.S. taxpayers and cost $9.7 million, as reported by Jeffrey Jackson from The Highwire. Olson Kennedy expressed concerns that the results of the study would be weaponized if released, since they do not show an improvement in mental health for children who received puberty blockers. I think that have looked at the research independently of what the mainstream media tells us, have seen that, in fact, these types of interventions for gender dysphoria actually result in more suicide and more negative outcomes in direct opposition to what parents were told. So parents have been lied to, and it looks like there's some accountability coming down the pike, at least for this one doctor, Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy. And this is reported by The Highwire. I will link that below as well. They do excellent journalism at The Highwire as well. Specifically, Dr. Olson Kennedy allegedly failed to inform the patient of other potential options, and of the potential harms of the medication. The lawsuit alleges that Olson Kennedy pushed the child in this case and her parents down this transition path by engaging in intentional, malicious, and false representation and oppressive concealment of important information. The plaintiff's lawyer suggests Dr. Olson Kennedy had a duty to inform her patient that there is a lack of adequate clinical research supporting this treatment. What? But we've been told that this is what they have to do, or the child will themselves, or the child will have worse health outcomes if we don't do these incredibly invasive, irreversible medical interventions on the child. And that legal system is often the only way that the actual true science comes out. I remember the FCC case dealing with 5G radiation and the radio frequency toxicity that is caused by our devices. The science was there. I worked with the attorney who worked on the case, and I saw with my own eyes, she had mountains and mountains of evidence that just isn't in the mainstream. It just isn't communicated at all. People have no idea. But when it comes to court and evidence, it's all there. And they won that case. Children's Health Defense and Daphna Tackover won that case against the FCC to reevaluate their guidelines for radio frequency that comes from these devices, from cell phones, because of the scientific evidence. So now here we have this gender transition doctor being sued because she didn't point out the fact that there's no clinical evidence that this is actually helpful, that these puberty blockers, for example, are going to help the child feel better and feel more comfortable in their bodies, or whatever the parents are told. There's no evidence. It's just marketing. So much can be avoided if you understand marketing and you understand that marketing is a huge element of all of parenting information that you get, unless it's a very independent source like the Highwire, like Children's Health Defense, like Primal Parenting, right here, bringing you the real science so that you can make truly informed decisions for your children. So yes, despite all of the bad news and how media works, Make America Healthy Again, the MAHA commission that has been initiated by RFK Jr. is in effect. We're on our way. And so I thank you for being here on the Primal Parenting Podcast. Please drop comments. Let me know what you hope the MAHA commission will address. What is your biggest concern in the children's health epidemic, or should I say illness epidemics, the chronic disease epidemics in childhood that are continuing to explode exponentially? Autism, ADD, neurological conditions, life-threatening allergies and asthma, mental health disorders. What are the causes of this most near and dear to your heart? Let me know in the comments. I saw firsthand at Children's Health Defense, the doctors that spoke the truth, that had the courage to stand up and speak out with real science. They were systematically attacked and destroyed by these medical boards, the state medical boards. Just unbelievable. And what is the best way to handle gender dysphoria? We can't ignore this issue either. These kids need help. This is happening for some reasons. RFK Jr. had illuminated some research on atrazine and other chemicals, agro-chemicals that are in the food supply that could be contributing to this. So again, back to the enormous need for reform of our food supply, agricultural industry, and of course, big pharma and big formula. In this case, just pumping those little babies full of heavy metals that are known neurotoxins. So get your informed consent, parents. Go to gmoscience.org for more information on the baby formula testing, an excellent independent research organization, gmoscience.org. And that's where you'll find the work of Dr. Seneff and Dr. Pero. And thank you so much for joining me, Angela Braden, your host on the Primal Parenting Podcast. If you would like to donate to support our work here at Primal Parenting, please do so at the link below. And we'll see you next time on the Primal Parenting Podcast.